Thanks very much for inviting me, and I'm honored to speak here. I was told that a Georgian language text was already distributed, and I would hope that most of you may have had a chance to have a look on it, or maybe you have already seen my publications on the topic of today's lecture. So what I want to do here is basically in two parts. First, outline the different scenarios that one can imagine for this so-called gray zone, as I call it, or as it's generally called, and then the scenarios that have we have been observing in the past, but also possible solutions for the gray zone, for the internationally embedding the gray zone. And then in the second part, I want to talk a little bit about the reasons and for the emergence of the gray zone, and why these four countries located in the current gray zone in Eastern Europe are still in this non-embedded situation, and also what I see as the problems for a future solution. Again, this is something very much related, of course, to the very emergence of these gray zone countries. So if you look at the current situation of the various countries in Eastern Europe, in post-Soviet, post-communist Eastern Europe, after 1991, it's quite striking that in a way you would not need to know much about the history and culture and the politics, the domestic politics, I mean, of the current Eastern European states in order to immediately understand what is the problem here by just looking at the international organization of the post-Soviet East European state. So the paradox, or the sort of the revealing thing here, is that we tend to talk about the current problems that countries like Georgia and Ukraine have, often in terms of ideologies and history, and above all in terms of Russian imperial nationalism. So this is the main, I think, narrative that you hear in Ukraine, and frankly, I suspect that you often hear also as in Georgia is what I think. But if you would just look at the international organizations in Eastern Europe, you would not have to know anything about this. You would just look which countries are members on the one side of Nato and the European Union, and which other countries are, on the other side, members of the Russian-dominated organizations, namely the Eurasian Economic Union and the so-called Collective Security Treaty Organization, or Tashkent Pact. And it's quite striking that exactly those four countries that do not belong to either of them do not fully control their territories, and they have territorial conflicts, and since 2014, all four of them are, in a way, you could argue, failed states. And this is exactly the gray zone. One could argue, of course, how much Armenia and Belarus are sovereign states by virtue of being members of the Eurasian Economic Union and the CSTO, but at least formally they fully control their territories. And in a way, this is the core of the problem, that these four countries that are in between, namely Azerbaijan, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, are not members of any of these two blocs. And that is what I also mean by the gray zone, and I think that's a pretty easy thing to understand, and you would not need to know actually much about the region. If you just knew about these organizations, you would already understand the problem. So what would be solutions to the gray zone problem, and what are the main problems in the past and I think also in the future for this gray zone? I think the discourse that you mostly hear in the West still more so before, less so today, but still I think it's one of the major, at least, discourses in countries like Germany, but even in countries like the US, you have often a discourse that comes down to the idea that the problem of this region is that we haven't really gotten all together at one table, the West, Russia, the gray zone countries, and we haven't really talked with each other and tried to find seriously enough a solution. And what should have been done earlier, and would also presumably be the solution for the future, is to come to some sort of great bargain, to have a big deal, a large treaty perhaps, between Russia and the West, involving in one way or another, hopefully also the four gray zone countries, and then we would solve everything. The problem with this scenario, which is still very popular, at least in Germany, but also in other countries, and even in the US, I think in the US, I think it has less to do with sort of geopolitical naivete, as I would see it, is the main problem in Germany. I think the popularity of this grand bargain idea comes mainly out of geopolitical realism, as it is seen, namely that the real confrontation in the 21st century will be not between the East and West in general terms, but between China and the West, and that the West needs, for this confrontation with China, Russia as an alliance. And there are people, I think this is now a little bit, this discourse has gone to the background, because of all these revelations about Russian attempted interference into American domestic politics. But at least before all of these things became open, this was also a fairly widespread discourse in the US that you need to get at a table with Russia. You need to solve all these problems in Georgia and Ukraine and perhaps also other countries, in order to come to a bargain, and then, on the basis of such a bargain, build an anti-Chinese alliance. This is not such a big issue in Western Europe, as far as, at least I do not perceive it that way. I think in Western Europe there's more this sort of a discourse about the common European home, and aren't we all Europeans, and shouldn't we all sort of just get together and to build together a united Europe. It comes less out of geopolitical realism, but more out of what I would call sort of European idealism. Anyway, the result in both the US and the EU is the same, that there is this idea that you can have this grand bargain with Russia, and this would be a solution. But the problem, of course, with this is that this is something that, in a way, has been already tried in one form or another several times, that we had the various agreements, bilateral and multilateral agreements, concerning this or that East European state. In Georgia, this is, of course, the most well-known one is perhaps the Sarkozy plan of 2008, which was a Western promoted peace treaty between Georgia and Russia, and has simply not been fulfilled by Russia. But this is not the only agreement that has not been fulfilled. The Budapest Memorandum, the bilateral 2003 Ukraine-Russia border treaty signed by Putin. The ratification document has been signed by Putin himself. The 1991 Belarus agreement about the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which is also a ratified treaty, unlike the Budapest Memorandum, or the 1997 Russian-Ukrainian friendship treaty. Or you could even mention the treaties concerning Transnistria, namely the 1994 bilateral treaty between Moldova and Russia about the withdrawal of troops, or the 1999 so-called OSZE document, a multilateral document in which Russia obliged itself to withdraw troops from its troops from Transnistria. So the problem here simply is that you could sign a new treaty with Russia about some sort of solution, some sort of condominium in Eastern Europe, but then the suspicion would be, at least I think for many nations in Eastern Europe, that this new agreement will not be fulfilled by Russia, because there are so many other agreements that have also not been observed, the latest one being the 2003 agreement between Russia and Ukraine concerning the Azov Sea, when the 3 ships were seized and the sailors were imprisoned, which was in contradiction to this treaty about the Azov Sea. The second problem with the Grand Bargain is that Russia would demand something in exchange for a sort of settlement, and there is actually some realism here, I would say more realism in Germany than in the US. So in the US, one of the authors who has written about this has proposed to exclude the East European countries that are currently in the gray zone from NATO. I think that would be a deal that would probably not work, that Russia wouldn't sign. But there have been more realistic, I would say, proposals, namely by a couple of authors in Germany called Matthias Debinski and Hans-Joachim Spanger, who have proposed that the West should offer Russia to exclude Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, not only from NATO. That's relevant for Georgia and Ukraine, not so much for Moldova, but also to exclude these 3 countries from EU accession in the future, and so not to just not give a membership perspective, but actually to fix in a document the non-membership of these countries in the European Union. That might be something that Russia could perhaps agree to. That would be a serious offer that would at least be, I think, as such welcomed in Moscow. The problem here being with both the exclusion of Georgia and Ukraine from NATO and the exclusion also of Moldova from the European Union is that this would obviously contradict quite blatantly earlier documents passed by these institutions. For NATO, that's the most easiest, the more easier story. We have the 2008 Bucharest Declaration from this NATO summit in Bucharest 2008, which says quite explicitly that Georgia and Ukraine will become members of NATO. Unfortunately, it doesn't say when and how, but at least it says they will become members of NATO, and if NATO would now say that they will not become members of NATO, that would be a fairly embarrassing situation, I think, and I can't imagine that something like this can be done. With the European Union, it's a less straightforward story, but as you probably know, the Treaty on European Union, I think Article 49, says that every European country has the right to apply for membership, and then has also the chance to become a member. Currently, this is not so much a topical issue because the 3 countries that have signed the association agreements would first have to implement the association agreements before it becomes a topic for real discussion, that whether these countries and when these countries can become members of the European Union. But to now say for the European Union that 3 European countries will definitely not become members of the European Union would obviously be a violation of the Lisbon Treaty, so to say, of the Constitution of the European Union. I think that's the problem with that. And here for Ukraine, there's also then the more specific problem that I cannot imagine a grand bargain with Russia in which Russia would return Crimea to Ukraine with the current government, at least. Maybe if there's a regime change, some sort of major disturbance in Russian politics, that one could perhaps imagine this, but in the near future, I think that's excluded. And if the West would now agree to a grand bargain with Russia in which it would, so to say, agree that either implicitly or perhaps even explicitly, but explicitly it wouldn't probably happen, but in even a grand bargain that would not explicitly acknowledge the Crimea annexation, but would perhaps not mention the Crimea annexation and would sort of implicitly accept it by the very fact of signing such a grand bargain, however, this would be an even stronger violation of the logic of the non-proliferation regime for nuclear weapons than Russia's annexation of Crimea, because then you would not just have Russia in a way as a violator of the whole logic on which the non-proliferation treaty and the non-proliferation regime are built, but also then if the Western countries would silently agree to the annexation, this would be an even more fundamental break of the whole logic of the non-proliferation regime. So the price for such a grand bargain would be extremely high, and that's why I think this is that is at the end of the day, I think that is a mirage, at least with the current leadership of Russia, to sign such a grand bargain. But I'm mentioning this here in such detail because, unfortunately, it is very much discussed. So I think most people here in Georgia and in Ukraine as well, this will be just a non-starter, and people wouldn't spend much time on it, and would be sort of a commonplace for everybody that this will not work. But at least in Germany, where I know the discourse quite well, this is a rather popular solution to the gray zone problem, which I think also in Germany is and in other West European countries is acknowledged as a problem. And I think actually for many people in the West, this is the most preferred solution to the whole conflict with Russia, to have this sort of grand bargain, negotiation, then some sort of treaty in which all of this would be solved. In Ukraine, and I suspect in Georgia as well, there's obviously another preferred solution for the gray zone problem, and that is NATO membership. In Georgia, as far as I understand, this has been already the preferred option, security option for the country for many years, and for large majorities in Georgia. In Ukraine, this is a more recent phenomenon. The expert community and the larger part of the political elite of Ukraine has already for a long time been pro-NATO, but the population of Ukraine, one should acknowledge, was until 2014 much more ambivalent, and there was actually a majority for quite a long time against Ukrainian membership in NATO. This has radically changed since 2014. Not only because the part of the population that is presumably anti-NATO is not any longer included in the polls, namely the populations of Crimea and the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic, but also in the East Ukrainian and Southern Ukrainian populations that are still controlled by the government. The mood is changing. There's still in these regions not clear majorities for NATO membership, but on the whole, for the government-controlled territory of Ukraine, which excludes 7% of the territory of Ukraine, there's now also a stable majority of the population that is for NATO membership. So this is now also for Ukraine, as for Georgia already for a long time, a clear picture. And one would think that therefore the chances are good. You have the explicit membership perspective from the already mentioned 2008 Bucharest summit declaration of NATO. You have majorities in both countries for NATO membership. But still, I think NATO membership is far, far away. And I would even say that the situation may be as absurd as that these countries, Georgia and Ukraine, will only become members of NATO when they will not need NATO membership that much anymore, namely when they have solved their conflicts with Russia, which then would make NATO membership still perhaps desirable, but make it much less much less salient issue than it is now. The problem here is quite simply that not NATO, in a sort of narrow sense, itself takes the decision. It's not the bureaucracy or the military or political command of NATO that makes this decision, but the decision, as you probably know, is made by the member countries of NATO in the North Atlantic Council, and all of them would have to agree. It's a consensual decision about taking in new members. Each country has potentially at least a veto power, and while I could imagine in a hypothetical vote in the North Atlantic Council that several or perhaps even many East European countries would vote in such a hypothetical vote in the North Atlantic Council for Georgian and Ukrainian membership, perhaps also the North American countries, namely the US and Canada, would perhaps vote for NATO membership. There would be several or perhaps even many West European countries that probably would vote against a new expansion of NATO to the east, and exactly because there are these problems that the potential new member countries have, even if there may be much sympathy in these countries for the fate of Georgia and Ukraine, I think such a vote would probably fail. There would be always a couple of at least countries that would vote against. I suspect there would be actually quite a few countries that would vote against. So I've made myself in Ukraine lots of enemies with simply saying this, what I think is a sad fact. I don't think that's, if you ask me what would be the best solution for Georgia and Ukraine, I would straightforwardly say, membership today for both of these countries. I think that is the countries have earned it, and they should be members of NATO. I think it would also solve their problems. Basically, that would make them much more secure, and would be a solution here to the gray zone country. But unfortunately, the mood in Western Europe is just not there to take in new countries that have these territorial conflicts with a nuclear superpower. I think that's at the end of the day what it comes down to. And therefore I would not just say that this NATO membership idea, or at least entering NATO in the soon future, is unfortunately an idle idea. It's also, in a way, a wrong idea, by which I mean that it is an idea that, at least in Ukraine, and I suspect it's very similar in Georgia, that is taking, to my taste at least, up too much of the energy and attention and time of the experts, the diplomats, the politicians of these two countries, who talk a lot about NATO membership, and I think that should be done. But I think the illusion here that many have, at least in Ukraine, and I suspect that is very similar in Georgia, is that the problem has been why these countries have not yet entered NATO, that they have not knocked loud enough at NATO's door. And if they would only knock loud enough at the door, then at the end of the day, the door will open. I suspect they can knock as loud as they want. The door will not open as long as there are these unresolved territorial conflicts, simply because the stakes are too high, and therefore the national interests of at least of many West European countries would be such that the door will not open. And that's why I think is also quite simply the reason that there is no such vote in the North Atlantic Council, because it would be clear that it would be unsuccessful, and therefore there is no progress here. The scenario, I think, which is generally underestimated is in terms of security and also in terms of actually implementation, is a quite simple and seemingly obvious scenario: EU membership. I think there are two lines of thinking here. The one reason that people don't talk about EU membership as a solution to the security problems of Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine is that they do not see the European Union, as I would think, enough as a security relevant actor, as a geopolitically relevant actor. So the focus is very much on NATO, which is an explicit military alliance, which is the organization with the big guns. The European Union is not such an organization. It's not an explicit military alliance. It has now, after the dissolution of the West European Union, also a security, an explicit security guarantee in its treaty. But still, it's not. It's a very different organization from NATO, and it's much less potent in military terms. I think the European Union is nevertheless extremely important in security terms because it has enormous economic leverage. And I would even venture to speculate that maybe one of the reasons that the city of Narva in eastern Estonia has not yet become Russian. The city of Narva, as you may know, is a Russian city by its population largely. Over 90% of the citizens of this East Estonian city are ethnic Russians. And my suspicion is that there would be in Moscow a number of people who would love to show NATO its impotence by simply taking Narva and then waiting what would happen, because I think NATO would then be in a very problematic situation. There would be then the mandate, clearly, to take back Narva, but how would you take back a city by military means where the local population would be supporting the occupant? So there would be Russian troops occupying a Russian city, and it would be very difficult, I think, just to restore Estonia's territorial integrity with military means. Even if a country like the US would decide to do it, how would you actually do it? You know, you cannot bomb a city, and if you have the local population not on your side, I think that would be an enormous challenge for NATO to do anything to restore territorial integrity. I think what is protecting perhaps Estonia and Narva here more than NATO is the membership of Estonia in the European Union, because the European Union has economic instruments that it would then probably apply. So Estonia, if it would be attacked in such a worst-case scenario, would of course ask for support not only NATO but also the European Union. And that would be a very different case from an attack, from those attacks that we've seen in Georgia or in Ukraine, because they are not members of the European Union. So the European Union would have to react in a very different way to such an attack of Estonia, and it would have enormous leverage here. It could basically, it could cause, if it wanted to, and then the question is whether it would do so. It could cause an economic collapse in Russia because of the mutual dependence that the European Union and Russia have in their energy relations. So I think that the European Union has actually quite a lot of power. It's not so much military power, but it has a lot of economic power. So entering the European Union will be actually a big deal. The other argument usually why people do not see the accession to the European Union as a solution to as a viable solution, as a feasible solution for countries like Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova is because there is no membership perspective, and there are only association agreements, and the association agreements that have been signed do not include in their preambular membership perspectives, as clearly these countries wanted. At least for the Ukrainian case, I know that Ukraine wanted, when the association agreement was negotiated, to include a membership perspective in the preambular, at least a sort of a vague membership perspective. This has not been done. But my feeling is, and I wonder what you think here about, is that once countries like Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova have actually implemented their membership, their association agreements, I don't see how the European Union could then actually reject an application of these countries. So this is this is of course a speculation in a way what would happen in such a case. But I think the pathos, the history, the ideology, the identity of the European Union is such that if you have European countries that have implemented such far-reaching association agreements as were signed with these three countries and that are ready to enter the European Union, there's no way the European Union can actually get out of it because it would be losing its face. And the European Union is a different political organism than NATO. It is not a military alliance, as I said. It does not include the United States. It is more popular in Russia than NATO is. Actually, in the last year, the popularity of the European Union has, strangely enough, risen again in Russia in connection with the general change of mood in Russia, which included a rise of skepticism towards Putin and his surroundings, a rise of popularity of the US, which you could ascribe to the presidency of Donald Trump, but oddly enough also a rise of the popularity again of the European Union, which was actually quite popular in Russia until 2014, unlike NATO. So I think the European Union accession is actually unlike the case for the Central and East European country, an issue and an accession process that I think should be at least analytically distinguished from the NATO accession process. So whereas in Central and Eastern Europe, it was very much the case that these countries entered these two organizations sort of in parallel, and it was perceived by the elites both in these countries but also outside of these countries as these two accession processes as being connected and going in parallel, being linked to each other. My suspicion is that what we will observe here in these current gray zone countries is actually two separate processes of accession where European Union membership may actually precede NATO membership. The problem here, though, being that the implementation of the association agreements is a long process. The preconditions for starting membership negotiations with the European Union are much more complicated and much more numerous than with regard to NATO. So the question here then also arises, what do you do in the meantime before the association agreements are implemented and before these countries actually become ready to make a sort of a serious bid for membership in the European Union. This leads me then to yet another scenario that is what can imagine, namely some sort of special agreement between Georgia and Ukraine and the United States. There are several sort of different models one could look at here. The most appealing model would perhaps be security guarantees like the US gave, for instance, to South Korea in 1953, which is basically sort of the prototypical agreement for the US signing far-reaching security agreements with third countries that do not belong to NATO, and thereby actually implicitly also involving the other 28 NATO countries into these sort of security arrangements. So I mean, that's often not mentioned, but at least implicitly all of the NATO member countries are, via Article 5, also sort of indirectly involved in the security guarantees that the US is giving to South Korea, because if you imagine as in a sort of worst case scenario that there would be a war, let's say, between North Korea and the US in connection with these security guarantees given to the US to South Korea, then theoretically at least all of the 28 other member countries would have to support the US in its war with North Korea, if you would think in these categories. So this would be one model to get such a security agreement. That would be great, I think, frankly, for Georgia and for Ukraine. It would be much less complicated in a way than NATO, because then you would have just one actor on the other side. But there are also other schemes. There's the so-called major non-NATO ally status, which is a sort of a special agreement between the US and certain countries in the world, where these countries then get access to military hardware and perhaps also software from the US. And one proposal which we have recently made here and also presented just today here in Tbilisi with a colleague, Irina Vereshchuk, in Tbilisi, is to use the experience of the so-called Baltic and Adriatic charters for the Guam countries, and namely for Georgia and Ukraine. So if you have not heard of these charters, the US had, before the three Baltic countries became members of NATO, a special agreement with these countries that would prepare these countries for NATO membership. And actually this charter still exists, and it's still something sometimes referred to. It has now lost its salience since these countries have become members of NATO, but this is a sort of a model that could be also perhaps applied to Georgia and Ukraine. Another example in the same way is the Adriatic Charter between the US and the Western Balkan countries that prepares those countries that want to become members of NATO to finally become members of NATO. And the most stunning success here of the Adriatic Charter was, of course, the accession of Montenegro to NATO. And it's so stunning that, because less than 20 years before Montenegro became a member of NATO, it was bombed by NATO. And in spite of having been bombed by NATO in 1999, it in 2017 became then, as a result of, among other factors, the Adriatic Charter, a member of NATO. That could be perhaps also something for Georgia and Ukraine. Georgia and Ukraine have, of course, already their bilateral charters signed for Ukraine in late 2008 with the US, a charter about strategic partnership, and Georgia signed its charter, bilateral charter with the US in early 2009. But we think that Irina Vereshchuk and myself, as we expressed in this article, we think that an upgrade of these bilateral charters to a trilateral charter would actually be a symbolically and perhaps also practically important step forward. It wouldn't be, of course, something comparable to NATO membership, but still it would make the gray zone less gray. And the question would then be also whether Moldova and Azerbaijan would want to be parts of this. They would be, because they do not aspire for NATO membership, but Serbia as well. Serbia is not a NATO member candidate, but it has an observer status with the Adriatic Charter and may also perhaps one day even sign it, and then perhaps also one day become finally a member of NATO. So this would be yet another model for sort of developing a bilateral relationship between, and by bilateral I mean as one side being the gray zone countries and the other side being just the US. And the last but not least, actually I think most natural alliance, as I would see it, is what is often called the intermarium, which simply means an alliance of the East European countries. And I think it would be the most natural solution to the gray zone problem of these countries, because it would simply involve all those countries for whom Russia is a direct security threat, or who perceive Russia as a direct security threat. And these are not only the 4 countries of the gray zone. But these are also countries like Poland, like Romania, the Baltic countries, less so perhaps Slovakia and Hungary, but also in the elites of these countries. I think there are large parts of the expert communities and also of the political elites that do perceive Russia as a threat. But at least for countries like Poland, Romania, the Baltic countries, I think they have in fact a very similar view of Russia, very similar view, a view very similar to the view that the Georgian or the Ukrainian, Moldovan and Azeri elites have on Russia. This would be, in a way, of course, a relatively weak alliance. It would only involve countries that are militarily not particularly potent. They are also have not trivial armies, but they would not include a major military power, such an intermarium alliance. I think that was also the problem with Guam, with the Organization for Democracy and Economic Development, that it just included 4 countries that are militarily not particularly potent. But I would still think that an intermarium alliance that would include countries like Poland and Romania would be a significant step forward in making the gray zone less gray. A misperception is here often that this is principally excluded by the fact that Romania and Poland are members of NATO. I don't think this, or the Baltic countries, or perhaps Hungary and Slovakia, if they would decide to join an alliance like that. And the simple reason is why I reject this argument is that we have actually a prototypical case already for that. Already a NATO member country, apart from the US, has already sort of crossed this red line, a non-nuclear country, namely Turkey, which has in 2010 signed a mutual aid pact and strategic partnership treaty with Azerbaijan. And this is a fully ratified treaty between Turkey and Azerbaijan, and Article 2 of this treaty between the NATO member, Turkey, and that is the important thing here, and the non-NATO member, Azerbaijan, says that both of the parties of this treaty would come to each other's help if one of them is attacked. It's not, of course, as strong a security commitment as Article 5 of the Washington Treaty of NATO, but it is a fairly far-reaching, far-going formulation that provides, in fact, Azerbaijan with a security guarantee by Turkey. How much this is still valid today with the special relationship that Erdogan and Putin have recently developed, I wonder, but at least this treaty still exists, and it's fully ratified, and it has been obviously, or it had to be accepted by NATO, and this red line has already been crossed. And then the question is, of course, why has something like that not yet happened in Eastern Europe? One of the explanations I would have here for this is, in particular, what concerns the Polish-Ukrainian relationship, and I think in such an intermarium coalition, the Warsaw-Kiev axis would be, of course, the most important one. The reason that these 2 countries have not yet come to some sort of closer cooperation and perhaps even to some sort of mutual security aid pact or mutual aid pact is that they have a fairly hot historical quarrel about the interpretation of certain events during World War II. You may have heard of this. This has to do a lot with the memory policies of Ukraine after the Euromaidan, which mainly concerns the organization of Ukrainian nationalists and the so-called Banderovцы, which is a topic that is unacceptable, basically, a kind of historical memory and memory policies that Ukraine currently has that is unacceptable for for Poland because of a massacre that happened in Volyn in 1943. This is one of the reasons I think that we do not yet see closer Polish-Ukrainian cooperation. But I think also, and now I come already to the reasons why the gray zone still exists. The larger reason that we do not yet have, that the gray zone has emerged and that we do not yet have a solution for the gray zone problem of these four countries is that we have in many of the East European capitals what I would call strategic provincialism. And that sounds a little bit sort of offending, but strategic provincialism is also something that I think the German political elite is suffering from, and has been even in the past much more suffering from. And what I mean by strategic provincialism is basically that the political elites and intellectual elites of the countries in question, namely of the East European countries, they look to Washington, they look to Brussels, they perhaps also look to Paris, London, perhaps also Berlin, and they take the clues for the formulation of their own security priorities from the discourses of these capitals. And what they hear in Washington or in Brussels is something that they would then repeat at home as well. And if you, for instance, take the intermarium is not discussed in Washington or in Brussels, and that's why it's also not discussed in Bucharest or in Warsaw, or even less so, of course, in Budapest or in Bratislava, although these are direct neighboring countries of Ukraine. And I think they would, if there was less strategic provincialism, they would be perhaps discussing the intermarium, not so much because they love Ukrainians that much, but because they would understand the stability of the Ukrainian state as their own national, as in their own national interest, and as something that they have to take care of, and that cannot be ascribed to some sort of other power. Another reason, I think, for the non-emergence of some sort of intermarium or other security solution for the gray zone countries is what I would call a sort of galactic or astronomic view on East European geopolitics, and by that I mean that many of the East European intellectuals and politicians and diplomats, they tend to see Eastern Europe as being divided into two planets. The good planet is the EU-NATO planet, and the other planet is the bad planet with all the rest, basically. And that is something that you can find on both sides of the frontier. You can find that in Warsaw and Bucharest, but you can also find that very much in Kiev, and I would suspect maybe here as well, that this is that is the world we live in. The world is divided into these two planets. But things are not that easy. The EU and NATO are, of course, very powerful actors. But when I go to Poland, I usually ask my Polish colleagues there, what do you do actually if the Ukrainian state collapses? Which is not an entirely fantastic scenario. It's probably something thought a lot about in Moscow. It's maybe a scenario that Russia is working towards. What will you actually do if that happens? What do you do? Okay, I can imagine what you would do when the first 300,000 refugees from Ukraine arrive. We've seen that it would be perhaps something similar like in Germany when the refugees, you would have a welcoming culture. People would help these refugees, and they would collect money, and they would maybe take people in their houses and so on. And that may work for the first 300,000 refugees. But Ukraine has around 40 million. What do you do when the third million arrives in Poland? And that is not an entirely, if the hryvnia takes another dive, if there is a major instability, there could be huge streams of refugees, and then but the reply then usually is, well, we are members of the EU and NATO. You know, don't forget that. But what would then actually happen? So you know, so Poland would probably then come to NATO, and they would ask, you know, we have now this problem with all these refugees arriving. Help us, please. You know, we are in NATO. But NATO, I think, and maybe somebody would like to comment here on this. NATO, I think, would say, what do you want us to do exactly? You know, do you want us to go to war with Russia? Do you want us to have an out-of-area employment of NATO troops on Ukrainian territory? Do you want us to shoot Ukrainian refugees on the Polish-Ukrainian border? I think NATO is not made for this sort of, you know. NATO knows what to do if Russian troops arrive in Poland, but NATO does not have a plan if you have millions of refugees arriving. And then I think they would go to the EU. So Poland would go to the EU and would say, we are in the union here, don't you want to help us with all these refugees? And the Germans would say, really, you have refugees now, yeah? You know, what do you want? We have our refugees, you have your refugees, so, you know, you remember how you reacted when we asked you to take a few refugees. So this is, I think, and then actually you would have the intermarium, because then the people would realize, well, the EU and NATO will not help us much. Okay, the EU will probably send money, there would be sanctions against Russia, there would be all sorts of measures, but that wouldn't sort of take care of a Ukrainian collapse, and then you would actually have an intermarium. I think it sounds very. A friend of mine, when I told him about intermarium, he asked, intermarium, delphinarium. You know, this is a sort of the intermarium is not as fantastic a scenario as many people think. I would go as far as saying that if you have really an escalation in Ukraine, there will be an intermarium, not because the Poles love the Ukrainians so much, but maybe because they don't love them that much. They don't want to have millions of Ukrainians on Polish territory. So this is, I think, these are two of the reasons: the sort of strategic provincialism and the sort of astronomic or galactic view of East European politics. I think the major mistake that has been made in the 1990s was that the West had no plan for a democratic Russia, and this is especially sad, I think, on the background of, if you compare the behavior of the West towards Russia in the 1990s to the behavior of the West towards Germany after World War II. So it's quite stunning if you think today that 6 years after World War II, Germany was included in the European coal and steel community. And 10 years after World War II, Germany was included into NATO. Yeah, so and there was no game plan for Eastern Europe in general, and in particular for Russia. I think that's at the end of the day the reason why we are in this situation here. So neither was there a plan for Russia, nor was there a plan for the other succession countries of the Soviet bloc. So there was this sort of spontaneous, impulsive, I would say, extension of NATO and the EU. But there was no thinking about what actually happens to those countries that are not part of the expansion of NATO and the EU. There was no strategic foresight here. So this is, I think, what I would say as an introduction, and I'd love to hear now your comments and questions.
Okay.